a wonderful parable. Not a parable, it's a story. The Gospels are so wonderful to preach on because stories are so open-ended, right? There's so many different ways that you can walk away from a story and have your own experience from it. Like, so if you read, the epistles, that we read for the Gospel, they're pretty straightforward. They're letters, and there's something really clear that you're saying to somebody. But when you have a story, it's like if you ever known someone or been in a car accident and everyone comes away with like a different story of what happened, right? Or someone tells a story of what happened, you're like, I was there, that's not what happened, right? You're seeing the same things, you're experiencing the same stuff, but you're walking away with a different story. And this is perhaps a little bit of the frustration, but also I think the great beauty and power of stories and why the Gospels preach so easily and why people love to read them so much and why there's so much depth in them. And so I'm going to focus on a more obscure point in this story, and that is the fact that Jesus sent his disciples ahead of him into the boat, sent the multitudes away, and what did he do? We just read it. Well, what did he do before he came out and walked on the water? He went up by himself to pray. And this is significant because if you look at other stories in the Gospels, you will notice a similar pattern. And that is often, before something big and important happens, before a miracle happens, what does Jesus do? He prays. So I ask you this. If Jesus needs to pray, how about you? Right? If he makes time for prayer alone, how much more do we need that time? So one of the differences between Jesus and Peter, right, is obviously Jesus walked on the water and Peter sank. But one of the other differences is that Peter wasn't alone praying, and Jesus was. And so we have this important model for us. We see, well, when else do we see Jesus going alone to pray? What's probably the most famous example? Garden of Gethsemane. Thank you, Marianne. Yeah, Garden of Gethsemane, right? We learn about that in Holy Week. He goes off by himself to pray, and who can't seem to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane? The apostles, right? They fall asleep, right? Before the Transfiguration, right? Or at the Transfiguration, which feast is coming up this week, Jesus goes up to a mountain to do what? To pray. And what happens? The apostles see him in his glory, and they see Elijah, and they see Moses standing next to him, right? In the context of prayer, with the preparation of prayer. This emphasizes that for us in our spiritual lives, that if we want to be able to withstand the storms, if we want to be able to walk out and meet Jesus in the midst of difficult times, which is what this boat in this story is an analogy for, we need to have a life of prayer. Oftentimes, when difficult times hit, people are unprepared for them in their life because they haven't spent the years or the months ahead of some crisis preparing and cultivating their inner life and their heart. And this is the challenge. Often we don't think we need God or the church until our life falls apart. And that's one of the missions of the church, is that, people ignore the church, they neglect their spiritual life, and you know what? When things catch up to them and their lives fall apart, guess what? The church is there for them. Even if they haven't been there for the church. Because that is what Jesus did in his life and ministry. And that's what we're called to do as a church, is to help people pick the pieces back up. But that's kind of a hard way to live. An easier way to live is to do that preparation, so that when difficult times come, you don't sink. Right? So that when dry times come, you've dug a well by prayer deep in your heart, and you have reservoirs to draw from when things and times are difficult. Right? This is why we fast. We voluntarily take on hardship and practice hardship so that when real hardship comes, we have a little bit of experience dealing with it. Right? And so prayer, this type of prayer where Jesus goes alone by himself, for us what this means is every day we need to have a little bit of time by ourselves. 5, 10 minutes at least every day where we're quiet and it's just us and God. We need that. We need that to do what? To go inward. Because if you look at the Gospels, sometimes we think of prayer that we're calling out to God, we're looking up in the sky for God. God's not up in the clouds. If you want to look for God, you have to go inside yourself. Which is probably a little more scary, isn't it? Because one of the challenges with prayer is that you're not only encountering God, but you encounter yourself. You like yourself or not, whether what's inside there is the prettiest or not. You have to go inward. And to do that, to kind of go inward and to explore this inner universe, right, and to cultivate your inner life, you have to remove distractions. And so that's why it's important to have a little bit of time every day where it's quiet, where you're alone, where there's silence, where you can be still. You know, there's a great interview, I think it was with Dan Rather. He's interviewing Mother Teresa, and they're talking about her prayer life. And he asks, well, you know, when you pray, what do you say? Like, what do you say to God? And she goes, I don't say anything. I just listen. Okay. Well, what does God say to you? Nothing. God just listens too. And one of the most important things with prayer is this skill of listening. Because prayer isn't just about, like, I'm going to cross myself, I'm going to do my vows, right? I'm going to kneel for the Lord's Prayer, right? It's not about, I'm going to light a candle. If it's just that, if it's just those external things, right? If prayer doesn't penetrate any further in than our physical bodies, if it's not anything more than some kind of routine and rote program that we do, Jesus has some pretty harsh words for that. It's the words he gave to the Pharisees. Because that's the kind of prayer that they practice, a prayer that only scratched the surface. And it oftentimes was just something that they did either to show off for other people or to make themselves feel spiritual. Right? And this is a danger. When people do good deeds, when they volunteer, unfortunately often one of the greatest motivators, and if we're honest with ourselves, this operates inside each of us, is that we do good for others so that we can feel good about ourselves. You see how we even take something that's supposed to be selfless and we turn it into some sort of selfish gratification where we go to church so that we can feel like a better person, whether or not we are. We help other people so we can feel like a good and nice person. Not so much about really helping and having true compassion for that person. The selfish inclinations of our own heart are very difficult to wrestle with. And in prayer, it's difficult. It is hard going inside. It's difficult to internalize our prayer. But that is the challenge. And so we have prayers and services in church to help us practice this. But we also need to have our own time at home where we have time set aside to be alone with God and to be quiet and to practice prayerful listening. And when we're in liturgy, it's not just about singing and saying things with our mouths or moving with our body. It's also about listening with our heart, about opening up so that the words can actually speak to us in some way, can actually move us internally. Because that's the real power of prayer, is that when it penetrates you, it changes you. And your whole life begins to become one of prayer, of walking prayer throughout your life. And when you've done what Jesus does, and you go aside, and you carve time out, right? You create room for miracles. You create room for God to show up and to work. And the reality is, and we'll talk about this more at the Feast of Transfiguration, if God is already working and already present, it's not like he's absent and you pray and he shows up. It's that he's already present and you pray and your eyes are opened. It's that God is already doing things. And all that prayer does is it takes away your blindness so you can actually see the God who's working around you. In the mundane and ordinary things of life, the kind of ordinary and uninteresting people you meet, all of a sudden become extraordinary and interesting and full of God. Glory to Jesus Christ.